Recently, there was this study that asked a large group of people this one question. It was, when you think about who you are, what are the first things that come to mind? Easy enough. Most people answered stuff that had to do with family. A lot of people said, oh, I'm a parent, or I'm a husband, or I'm a wife. It was very common to answer by profession. People would say, I'm an engineer, I'm a nurse. It was also pretty popular to have to answer the question with some positive traits that people believed about themselves. They would say, "Who am I? I'm kind. I'm trustworthy. I'm hardworking or honest." Perhaps a little bit surprising, at least it was to me, is that one of the ways that people answered was by mentioning negative traits about themselves. They would say, oh, I'm anxious, I'm overweight, I'm angry, I'm poor. I'm curious what you would say. What comes to your mind when you think about who you are? Who are you? Now, I suspect most of us would answer this question with something like, well, I'm a Christian, or I'm a follower of Jesus. But I also suspect that maybe for some of us, we would answer this way on a Sunday between 10 and 12, and perhaps some other way on a Wednesday morning or a Friday night. So who are you? The fact is that some of us don't know. Some of us think the worst traits about ourselves is who we are, like anxious or overweight. Some of us give answers that we think others want to hear. And I'd like for us to turn our attention to the reading from 1 Peter this morning as we contemplate this question, who are we? Because it's perhaps one of the most relevant passages in the Bible for any Christian wrestling with the question, who am I? So if you want to follow along, swipe to 1 Peter chapter 2. In this passage, the author of 1 Peter describes following Jesus. And the very first thing that he says to people who are either trying to follow Jesus or wanting to follow Jesus is he says, put away evil things. Things like hate, like lying, like hypocrisy, like jealousy. Put those things away and grow in your salvation. That's as if he's saying that's a little bit of a description of what this means to follow Jesus. You put away the evil things and you work on growing in your salvation. It's talking about followers of Jesus. It says, put away these evil things like hate and lying and hypocrisy and jealousy and focus on growing in your salvation. And it describes these followers of Jesus as somebody who's craving spiritual milk. Spiritual milk. Now, this is something that the New Testament mentions a few times, this idea of spiritual milk. In the book of Hebrews and the book of Corinthians, spiritual milk is something that is like basic teaching for people who are new in their faith. If you're a young Christian or you're a new Christian, it's not going to do any good to have complex theology. You need to start with the basics. That's spiritual milk. That's how it's described in Hebrews and Corinthians. But here, spiritual milk means something else. Here it's a reference to a baby's appetite for its mother's breast milk. Breast milk. It's the perfect food for that baby at that time. And the amazing thing about nursing a baby is that the thing that the baby desires the most is the thing that's best in the world for it. Breast milk. And the follower of Jesus is supposed to have the same sort of appetite for the thing that makes him grow up in salvation. The things that are best for the follower of Jesus should be those things that we crave the most. And then Peter says, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. I love this. It's as if he's saying, if you've tasted this breast milk, you know what I mean. But if you haven't, I don't know what to tell you. The simple fact of the matter is, once you've tasted the kingdom of God, everything else is toothpaste. Then Peter says something that is about rocks. And he's still talking about this idea of who are followers of Jesus. But he then starts talking about rocks. As you come to him, a living stone. So he's talking about Jesus. As you come to Jesus, who is a living stone, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood. Now, what is a living stone? So first of all, we need to understand that the author of the book of 1 Peter is employing a rhetorical tool where he's making certain claims about Jesus. He's calling Jesus certain things, and every time he calls him a thing, he precedes it with the adjective of as living. So he calls Jesus hope, but not just regular hope, he's the living hope. And he calls Jesus the Word, but he's not just the regular Word, he's the living Word. And here he calls him the stone, implying that he is a rock. He's the foundation of all we are and all we're meant to be. But he's not just a regular foundation. Jesus himself is the foundation of this thing that we as followers are coming to. But it's not just a normal foundation, a living foundation, a foundation that's full of life, a foundation that gives life, a foundation that conquers death. And when we follow him, we become like these living stones also. Like we're a part of the same house, where he's the foundation and we're all bricks that are going into this same house on his foundation. And then Peter says, all these things, all these other living stones, you and I, we make up a holy priesthood. Now here's the thing with the priesthood. In the religious system that Jesus and first century Palestinians were a part of, the priesthood was a class of people who offered sacrifices to God. It was essentially the spiritual elite. Without these people, without this class of people, there were no sacrifices. You couldn't make sacrifices to God. And this wasn't just something that the Jews had. Just about every religion at the time had this idea that there had to be a class of priests. But now there was this new reality where every follower of Jesus is set aside to offer sacrifices to God. That's what it means when he says that we are a holy priesthood. Every follower of Jesus is now set aside to offer sacrifices to God. But these aren't sacrifices of lambs or dove, but of praise and service. Interestingly enough, in the early church, the Roman Empire, which, as you know, persecuted Christians and didn't like Christians at all, they often thought that Christians were atheists. And part of the reason that they thought that the Christians were atheists is because they thought for sure all Christians had to have temples and priests and sacrifices. Whether it was a religion they liked or a religion they didn't like, these Romans, they thought all religions, they have to have temples and priests and sacrifices. But these Christians were weird. These Christians says, no, we have no need for temples. And they said, no, we are all priests. And they said, and Jesus is our sacrifice. And there is a spiritual elite. There's still a spiritual elite, but the spiritual elite is all of us. All of us who are living stones, a part of this body, and we make up this new holy priesthood. And then Peter goes on to talk about this living stone, and he quotes various places in the Old Testament to do it. And he says that this stone is the stone that the builders rejected, but it's become the cornerstone. course, the idea there that if you really want to build a building firm and straight, you need a good cornerstone. It's got to be the best stone in the entire in the entire building. The cornerstone has to be perfect. And Jesus was this cornerstone, but the builders tossed it out. They rejected it. Of course, referring to the fact that Jesus was killed by his own people. He was rejected by his own people. And then he also says, using a different verse from the Old Testament, that this stone, this living stone, is a stumbling block. So the thing is that it either becomes the foundation for our lives, for our church, for everything that we hold dear, or it's something that we trip over. And we see this today. We see this with people who might say, hey, I like your religion. It's pretty nice. You have good music and pretty windows and that sort of thing. But this Jesus thing, you say Jesus is divine, I just can't accept that. And they trip over Jesus. Or they say, I like your morals and stuff, but Jesus had to die for some sort of a sacrifice so that we could be made right to God. I just don't buy that. I can't accept it. And they trip over Jesus. So this living stone, although he is the foundation of all that is significant in our lives, he's not accepted by everybody. In fact, he was rejected by his own people. And even today, he's rejected by some who can't accept them, and he becomes a stumbling block. And so Jesus, the living stone, was not accepted by everyone and continues to be rejected, tossed aside, even by his own people. And you and I, as living stones in his likeness, may be tossed aside and rejected by our own people as well. So, who are you? Well, I can tell you who you're not. You're not what other people say about you, because other people might toss you aside and reject you. You're what God says about you. You're not what others say about you. You, as living stones, will be rejected. You will be maligned. There will always be others who say unkind or untrue things about you. Perhaps it's because of your faith, or perhaps it's just because we live in a cruel world. But that is not who you are. That doesn't define you. You are not what others think of you. And you know what else? You are not what you do. And you know what else? You are not what you have. Who are you? You're not what others think of you. You are not what you do, and you are not what you have. Do you want to know who you are? You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had received mercy, but now you have received mercy. That is who you are. Amen.